Thanks for the support from Bernstein Center. This research will address the question, has the progress toward gender equity in the boardroom moving at the glacial pace, and if so, why? Let's first look at the reality. So the dotted line is the US, and this plots the time series of percentage of women on corporate boards, public and private firms. And as you can see that the US is in the middle pack of the developed world. Europe is overall ahead. And also, if you look at the change in the US, indeed, up to about 2016, there was this notion about a glacial pace came along. But in the last 2 years, you can clearly see that the uptick is if now it's a glacial pace in the global warming. So there is hope coming along. There has been quite a divergence between public firms and private firms. Public firms have been under much more scrutiny, and the progress is much faster, but the same progress in the private company world has been largely absent. So this is the reality. So let me talk to the main point of the paper. Now, how can you increase the diversity of the board? So even though this research is about gender diversity, but the basic logic and the mechanism would apply to any general notions of diversity. Now, any improvement in diversity can only come at the turnover of the board. If the board does not turn over, then nothing could be changed. And if you look at the left panel, you will see that the turnover in terms of departure, the gender is on par with the board, which is understandable. When people leave the board, it could become because retirement, because of health reasons, personal reasons, there's no particular gender disparity over that. On the addition part, there's a quite significant upstick. So basically the progress you have seen comes from the addition part. So in the most recent year, 2019, it has been about 1/3. So 1/3 of the new members added to the board in 2019 were women. That is a significant increase over the previous years. But that change over the par level of the board only happened after the financial crisis was over. So that's why the progress seemingly has been low. Now, the important thing to point out is that when the board turnover is about 10%, then even if you're adding 25% of the women, so let's have a numerical exercise. If you're adding 25% of women to a board that's currently 20%, with the annual turnover about 9%, how long does it take for the current board gender representation to rise to halfway to 22.5%? The answer is 10 years. That's much longer than your intuition would direct you. So basically, when the turnover is low, no matter how aggressive you're putting more women on the board, on the margin, it still takes a long time for the current stock to change. And this reflects on extraordinarily long tenure of the board, as shown on the right panel. So you can see that comparing board members to CEOs, okay, so the percentage of CEOs that are being in a position for more than 10 years, it's about 6%. But over a quarter of the board members have been in the board seat for 10 years. Now, the percentage of CEOs in a position for 20 years almost does not exist. But however, about 5% of board members have been there for 20 years. And these extremely long tenured board directors are predominantly men, which regardless how you turn over the margin, the shift on the board diversity is relatively, the impact is low than people would have thought or would have hoped for. Now, how do we increase the board turnover? There is usually the chart I show you, this is a voluntary turnover. However, there's also a way to turn over the board much faster through external force. That's called a proxy contest. So in a proxy contest, meaning both sides, the corporate incumbent part, the dissident part, each nominate their own candidates to the board. And the shareholders would have a choice to see whether they elect the board, the management slate, or the dissident slate. I show this chart that basically say, whenever there's a proxy context, there tend to be 2 additional new members who will be elected to the board. Because if you ask the management to come up with their own nominees, they tend to nominate themselves or the incumbents. So proxy context is a way to dramatically increase the board turnover. However, mostly it has been a wasted opportunity for increasing board diversity. So the reason is that when a proxy context happens, then on average, there are fewer women who come as a dissident candidates compared to a turnover that is not contested, just a normal election. Now, it's the key point of the papers come at the next slide, because when you look at this, it's very tempting to argue proxy context or shareholder activism is bad for gender diversity. The reason that they tend to lead to fewer new candidates who are female to be added to the board compared to a non-contested turnover. Now, the result is actually the opposite. So I called the losing the battle, winning the war. So on the first regression, forget about regression, it shows that the percent of women added to the board is 3 percentage points lower when there's a proxy context relative to a non-contested election. Now, on the right regression actually show the presence of the proxy context actually increases the representation of women on the board. Why? Because it dramatically increases the turnover. So here's a situation. They increase the turnover of the board, but condition on the turnover, they elect fewer women onto the board. When you multiply by the 2 products, they will still lead to more women to be pushed into the boardroom. So this is what I want to emphasize as the key message, that the key is for gender diversity is to increase turnover, in addition to having more women to be on the nominees. So I'll just stop here. I think my time is over. Thanks for the support.
Okay, perfect. So you have one question in the chat. What are the implications for gender and racial diversity in academia where tenure leads to low turnover?
That's actually precisely, it's the way I motivate the research. Whenever you have extremely long tenure, it's very, very difficult to increase diversity in a short period of time. That's in fact, I think that question exactly hit on the point.
Perfect. And Professor Faroknia, please feel free to take yourself off mute to ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, Wei. Thanks for the presentation. Yeah. 2 quick questions. I was intrigued by your chart showing the difference between Europe and the US, specifically also Europe versus UK. Based on some numbers I know, in Germany and UK women representation is not that high. So I was just wondering if there's any specific country in Europe you've seen they have good practices such that it would bump the average in the Europe higher. And also in regard to, I was intrigued by your thoughts around proxy voting and contests. We know that there are firms like Depository Trust and State Street that vote on behalf of large institutional owners, and sometimes they just go by default. Any instances you have seen that there is a regulation or some mandate forcing such institutions to vote in scenarios like that and take into account diversity or not?
Yeah. So I think, in Europe, the Northern European countries, the Nordic countries are ahead of the West and the Southern Europe. And regarding the mechanism, I actually think there should be a term limit of the board directors, just like most of the other jobs. And in fact, I would encourage the large institutions to vote for the candidates to replace the long tenured candidates, rather than just simply vote based on gender or race. Because as long as you embrace the new pool of candidates, they're naturally more diverse. I think that's the key message I want to get out of this research.